Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 35th season, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It's also a slightly wider net than the Writer's Block. We have had on other brands of artists, painters, musicians, actors. So if you have an idea for a writer who might be a good fit for the Writer's Block or another brand of artist, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original programming that comes out of 1623 Studios is a result of cable access television. It's a very, very important, reliable community resource. You don't get it with Dish or other means of accessing the net. So stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. I'm happy to say this evening we do have a writer. Her name is Laura Plummer, and she's just come out with a new chapbook about Gloucester. That's why I'm wearing this t-shirt, this sweatshirt today, to advertise Gloucester, because she moved to Gloucester 10 years ago and fell in love with it. Laura Plummer, welcome back to the Writer's Block.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Tell me, because you weren't born and raised in Gloucester, where you were born and raised.
Well, I was actually born in Massachusetts, but I grew up in southern New Hampshire.
Way just across the line there?
Pretty much. Derry, south of Manchester.
Derry, oh yeah, that's very, 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 very close.
Yeah.
So how did you eventually migrate to Gloucester?
So for college, I went to the University of New Hampshire in the Seacoast. And when I graduated, I got a job in Boston. So I moved to Boston in 2007. And eventually, we wanted to leave the city to find cheaper rent because the prices were crazy.
And they're getting worse.
Yeah. So we looked on the North Shore, and we eventually just settled on Gloucester because we found a really great deal on an apartment. So that was kind of how we ended up here. We didn't know anyone here.
And you've been here now 10 years, or 11?
Almost 11, going on 11 now, because
11, yeah.
It was in the spring of 2014.
So it's been 10 years, 10 and a half years.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about Gloucester. I moved here a little earlier than you, but I felt the same way instantly, and I can't imagine ever leaving, and I don't intend to.
Yeah.
Tell me about the book that you just brought out. Its title is A Decade in Gloucester, Reflections on History and Home. And we're going to show that. We'll zero in now, but we're also going to have a JPEG put on the program by our excellent editor, Tyler. And we'll also have your website supered on the screen. When did you conceive of this chapbook about Gloucester?
So it all came together fairly quickly. I'll say toward the end of the summer, I had a lot of success publishing short pieces, poems and essays and short stories in different publications. And I felt that the next logical step was to come out with a collection. So some kind of themed collection that could showcase some of my work. And I was thinking about different themes, and it just turned out that I had quite a lot of material about Gloucester. And I thought, well, this could be a good idea for a collection. So I put a draft together and I mailed it out to a number of people in the community, and the response was so positive. So I knew that it would be meaningful, and I knew that I would want to move forward with it. So it really came together quite quickly after that.
It's good that you got advice from others in Gloucester, because Gloucester is legitimately very proud and very focused on its heritage. Great industrial heritage, artistic heritage, and very proud of that. Nobody's ever shy about promoting it either, and they shouldn't be.
Yep.
So this has been maybe 10 years in the in the brain case developing until you started to put the words down?
Right. So the pieces in here are an essay. It's like a core essay that kind of grounds the experience. And then it's got some poems as well that support kind of the message of the essay, which is coming to Gloucester, discovering my roots here, discovering my heritage here, and ultimately feeling a sense of home here. And the poems really speak to that.
And your background is Finnish.
Right. So part of my ancestry is Finnish. I'm kind of an American mutt, but I do have a strong Finnish heritage on my mom's side. And that was kind of what inspired me to start researching my roots here in Gloucester.
And you found out a lot of information. I know I lost my glasses here. I would like to ask you about a couple of individuals. Two of them are very important, Joe and Maddie. Who are Joe and Maddie, and why are they important to you?
Well, so Joe and Maddie are my great-great-grandparents, and they emigrated from Finland in the late 1800s, and they settled in Gloucester. As far as I know, they emigrated separately and met here, but they might have known each other. I'm looking into connections. And so they settled here, and I was here for several years before I knew that my ancestors lived here. So finding that out was really exciting. And in the essay, I speak more about Josephine, because she outlived her husband, Maddie, by quite a few decades. And there's just more information about her life. But I also wrote a poem called Joe and Maddie, which kind of celebrates their union and their immigrant story.
That's my next question. Would you read that poem, Joe and Maddie?
Absolutely.
About your two of your 16 great-great-great-grandparents?
Great. Yeah,
Great.
two
Two of the 16.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to.
Josephine and Maddie.
Sure. So, Joe and Maddie. They bravely crossed the ocean, escaping Russian rule. An older blacksmith, Maddie, and Joe, a lovesick fool. They married Christmas Eve and lived on Langsford Street. Young Maddie worked the quarries so both of them could eat. He quickly learned the language and taught some to his bride. She'd greet him, "Welcome home." His heart would swell with pride. Her Vili was perfection. Her Niswa was sweet. And when they danced the polska, he'd sweep her off her feet. A master of the stone, he worked the whole week through. Joe scrubbed his dusty trousers and packed his lunches too. They were not long alone, for soon the children came, a tribe of sons and daughters to bear the family name. When Maddie started coughing, Joe looked at him and sighed. "You ought to see a doctor." "No money," he replied. In 1907, they lived on Munsey Lane. His cough became persistent, combined with chills and pain. One morning in the springtime, Joe woke to find him cold. He'd left his body in the night at 49 years old. The pregnant widow crumbled. The babies toddled round. Joe laid her head upon his heart, but didn't hear a sound.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. They can't talk to you, but physically, but it seems as though they're talking to you spiritually. Do you feel that? Do you feel that presence?
I like to think so. That when I'm doing my research and I'm writing about them, I'm hoping that I'm doing them a service and portraying them accurately, telling their stories with the most accurate background. And I do hope that that's something that is reflected positively in the work.
Are there any pictures of them?
So, not to my knowledge. I have a photograph, but it's unclear who is in it. And the notes are not quite legible, so I don't want to assume anything. I'd rather err on the side of caution with that one.
Right, right. I'm familiar with old pictures from my own family that nobody thought of identifying, because everybody knows who Uncle Frank is and Aunt Sody, and then 2 or 3 generations later,
you have no
it's
idea.
a mystery.
Yep.
You did a great deal of research into Maddie and Josephine, and also I want to mention Chester Peterson, who's even earlier. Tell us something about the process of research. I mean, physically, I think we get questions about researching. What should I do? Where did you go? Who helped you? What institutions are important?
Sure. So my link to Gloucester was Chester. That was the original link, because he's my great grandfather, my mother's grandfather, and I knew that he was Finnish. That's all I knew about him. But when I found his birth certificate, it said Gloucester. So that was news to me. I didn't know that I had a connection in Gloucester.
Where did you find his birth certificate?
So I used a lot of online resources. Ancestry.com is a really great resource.
Say that again louder.
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry.com.
And I also used, in terms of finding all of the addresses where Josephine lived, I used the archives at the Cape Ann Museum, and I looked through old newspapers in the Cape Ann Sawyer Free Library. So it was really a matter of just collecting all of this historical documentation and kind of sifting through it for the information that I was looking for. But it was really like a treasure hunt, or like a scavenger hunt, because I never knew what I was going to find. And I just set about creating the story as accurately as possible. So I was discovering it as I was writing it. It was really very exciting.
Did you have any courses in college about researching or looking at old newspapers?
Well, so I never took research methods in college as an undergrad, but I worked on the student newspaper. And so I had that experience of journalistic research. I also did some undergraduate research assistantship. So I had experience with academic style research.
Yeah.
And I guess I kind of combined those two for this project.
I should have asked this earlier. Was your major English?
It was Spanish.
Spanish?
Yeah, Spanish and international affairs. So, but the journalism piece was really strong for me in college, so I spent a lot of my time working in that capacity.
I love that sensation of having an old newspaper in your hands. If they let you touch it.
Right.
If they let you touch it. And you have to put on clothes often, but it feels almost like a religious experience, opening something that's 150, 200 years old.
Yeah, most of my experience with those has been the digitized versions of the newspapers, which is great that those exist now, because you can find news from all over the world from any decade.
It's amazing.
It's incredible what you can find now online. And of course, the census just came out for 1950. So I was able to find more records of family members.
You tracked many of them down.
Yeah. So the census is only released, I forget how many, it must be like 70 years or so, because it was just released last year, I think. And that's mainly for privacy reasons, I think. But I was able to just confirm some additional information and answer some questions that I had about the research.
Even though the book is finished, are you still continuing some of that research?
So I'm glad you asked that. So the core essay, which is about finding my ancestors, I've expanded on it quite extensively. And this new project that I'm working on is actually a deep dive into Josephine's life. It provides a lot of historical context that you won't find in the essay. And it provides a lot of insight into her as a person and her personality. Because as I've continued to research, I've just found so much information. And I felt that it deserved its own separate project, its own separate kind of book.
A lot of these people who are in your family, ancestors in your family, are all buried here on Cape Ann?
So Maddie and Josephine were both buried in Seaside Cemetery. So back on Langsford Street, back in Gloucester.
Right on the water.
And right where they had basically lived as newlyweds, right there.
Yeah.
And they don't have headstones, unfortunately. So I was able to track down the person that oversees the cemetery, and they were able to find records of the internment, I think you would call it, but there were no headstones.
Oh, that's too bad, huh?
Right, and I think a number of their children were also buried there because at the time that was kind of like the Finnish, Lanesville was still the Finnish center on Cape Ann, and that's where a lot of the Finns were buried. So I think their children who ended up passing were also buried there. But again, there's just no physical marker for that.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, I would like to have a place to go and and remember them, but
I have a good friend in that cemetery. It's a wonderful place for a cemetery. I think it's right directly on the ocean, right?
It's beautiful. It overlooks the sea.
Yeah. I want to point out to our viewers that this chapbook is not all poetry. I think there's 5 poems and an extended essay that you mentioned, The Bones of My Ancestors, which is the essay that talks about the research, and then it's interspersed with other material, prose and poetry. And I think that combination is kind of clever because if you read a poem and then you read some prose, then you read another poem, and it keeps you on your toes. I didn't mean for that rhyme, but it does keep you on your toes. Would you read us another poem before we talk about a little more research? I want to see if you would read Who is Gloucester?
Sure. Yeah, so briefly to introduce this poem, ever since I came here, I've tried to kind of define, who is the Gloucester person. And I've found that it's just very hard to define because there are so many different Gloucesters, there are so many different cultures and subcultures. And this poem was meant to kind of explore that and the diversity of the town.
Right.
So,
yes.
Who is Gloucester? A cavalcade of writers who dazzle with their wit. A mighty throng of seamen, awash with God and grit. The poets and the artists who venerate these shores. The tourists in their flip-flops track sand into the stores. Disciples of St. Peter who worship by the sea. The wise Sicilian nonas reciting rosary. Descendants of the English, the Finns and Portuguese, who greet each other daily and coexist in peace. The wealthy in their mansions along a scenic drive, the minimum wage workers who struggle to survive. And don't forget the first ones to walk these storied hills. Their whispers linger in the wind, their drumbeats echo still.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to leave the book for very long, but I always like to ask some nuts and bolts questions about writing. When you're writing, working on a specific piece, of an essay or a poem, or the organizing the whole book? Do you have specific hours that you stick to and a specific place where you work?
So the place is easier to answer. I've been setting up in my living room. I have an office in my guest bedroom. Technically, that's my office, but I've always found I'm much more comfortable just writing in my living room. And usually because my cat was there. He passed away recently, but he was my writing companion, and he was just glued to me, and he was with me the whole time that I wrote this, literally draped over my lap as I compiled the stories and formatted them for
Well, that's
different.
a tough loss then, huh?
It's huge. He was with me for 16 years, so
How old?
16.
Ooh.
Yeah, so he was with me for 16 years, and he was my muse in many ways. And he was there during the writing, so it made, in the end, he wanted to be in the living room. He didn't want to be anywhere else. So I was with him, and we were very comfortable there.
Well, I'm glad he helped you out with the book.
Yeah.
So you read and write, preferably in the living room. And
Usually.
The bottom line question is, where's the computer?
So it's on my lap. I have my laptop.
Wherever you go.
It follows me,
Yeah.
but usually I'm writing from my laptop.
Do you ever write by hand, cursive?
No. The only time that I would do that is if I was maybe traveling. But even then, I would use my phone. I write on my phone as well, especially if I'm just trying to get some thoughts out and make some bullet points. But I gave up writing longhand a long time ago.
Really, yeah. I try to write as much as I can. I think there's some research about the hand motions and the muscular motions and your active brain are in sync, and it's kind of helpful. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Sure.
When did you start to send this out and send material out?
So the draft form?
Yes.
Well, I believe I sent a copy to you.
Yeah.
That would have been toward the end of the summer, maybe September. That's when I started to kind of get feelers out. I just wanted to know, like, is this something people would read? Is this a collection that's valuable? Does it tell a complete story? And so that was kind of the start of the project.
So, yeah, you did send me a electronic copy, which I was rereading this morning. What advice would you give to people who are watching the show and say, "Oh well, I want to talk about my grandfathers. Where do I start looking?" What would you advise them to do?
Oh my goodness. So I would say definitely know what you're trying to communicate and dedicate yourself to getting supports in place. I had so much support while compiling the research for this. I'm not a historian, I'm not a genealogist, and so I had to rely on professionals in these fields. And that really made my job a lot easier, just gathering a lot of support.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's good advice. Know where you're going, or at least have a general idea where so you're not floundering around.
Yeah, it's always good to have pointed questions. When you go to a historian or a genealogist, instead of saying, I'd like to know about this relative or that relative, you want to bring more specific questions. Were they born, date, times, places,
Yes.
things with concrete that can be easily found.
Yeah, people tell you that when you're writing anything, details, details, details. You got to make the reader present.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Absolutely.
thank you for that instructive, hard, nuts and bolts information. I want to ask you to read a couple more poems so that we can hit on all of them, although we're getting close to the end of time. You read Joe and Maddie. Can you read the last poem, which closes the book, the love poem for Gloucester?
Sure. So The love poem to Gloucester I wrote specifically for the Gloucester 400 Stories project
Yes.
because it had been kicking around in my head. I wanted to write something that was just a tribute, just very warm and fondly expressing my feelings for this town that has become my home. So that was the inspiration. A love poem to Gloucester. I came with just a suitcase. I never thought I'd stay. This town was just a detour, a pit stop on my way. Out west to California, where all free spirits go. To be sun-kissed and mellow, to hell with cold and snow. I couldn't have foreseen what lay in store for me, and many winters later, I'm blooming by the sea. For Gloucester sank her hook so firmly in my heart, it wasn't long before we couldn't be apart. She wooed me with her stories, a gripping history, her warm, inviting people, a vibrant tap. The glory of her nature is famous far and wide. I wander in her woodlands and on her beaches dry. And rising in the morning to hear Our Lady's song, I sometimes get the feeling I've been here all along. I always love returning when life calls me to roam. And though I wasn't born here, I now call Gloucester.
Thank you very much. I like the idea of closing the book with a love poem to Gloucester, and also the earlier poem, Who is Gloucester? Not what is Gloucester, but who is Gloucester? And you recognize properly that it's many, many, many identities, although the poor man at the wheel gets loaded down with everything. He's everything. If you need something for Gloucester, you need that.
That's true.
I want to thank you, Laura Plummer, for being on the Writer's Block and sharing your motivation and your research and background for the book. I want to read the title again. A Decade in Gloucester, Reflections on History and Home. I hope that the sales go through the roof.
Yeah, it's available in paperback, but it's also available in ebook, and you can find those links on my website.
And the website will be run with the show. I want to thank everybody in our TV audience as well for being with us. If you've learned something about Laura Plummer's discovery of her ancestry and discovery and development of her love for Gloucester, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.